Try again. So finally, we reach the best. To reach heaven in the shortest possible time was the goal of every medieval Christian. And the one thing that could be said without doubt was that it is beyond the best dreams of the human imagination. Between 1851 and 1853, John Martin painted this gloriously romantic view of the plains of heaven, the new heaven and new earth of Revelation, inhabited by angels and ready for the arrival of the blessed. So utterly different from the ordered and hierarchical view of medieval writers and artists. Here, the souls of the righteous are carried up into heaven by angels in this painting from 1516 by Hieronymus Bosch. One of the reasons I include it is it's so reminiscent of modern reported near-death experiences that it reminds us that people really haven't changed much over the centuries. The idea of the tunnel with the light at the end is universal. Now, two Old Testament figures are recorded in the Bible as being taken straight to heaven by God. Firstly, Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Here he is shown climbing up a ladder to heaven, assisted by Christ, in an 11th century Old English translation of Genesis in the British Library. The other is Elijah, who was recorded as being snatched up to heaven in a fiery chariot, dropping his mantle of prophecy onto his pupil Elisha. This episode is shown on one of the 5th century doors of Santa Sabina Church in Rome. The third person to ascend to heaven is, of course, Christ. The Roman Reiterschaffertafel of about 400 is an ivory plaque showing the women at Christ's tomb and the ascension. Christ clambers up the mountain and a hand reaches out from heaven to help him up. He has all the air of a victorious athlete climbing up to receive his prize. On an ivory panel made in Cologne in about 1150, we see Christ stepping up from the top of a mountain and breaking through the clouds to touch the hand of God. He leaves behind the apostles and the Virgin, and underneath is the prophet Habakkuk holding a scroll inscribed in Latin, "The sun has risen." Sun, S-U-N. Here we've got two very different views of Christ's ascension into heaven on the 5th century doors of Santa Sabina. In one, we see Jesus taken up by two angels in a flurry of movement, echoed by the confusion of the apostles left behind. Whereas in the other one, we see the triumphant Christ in heaven, surrounded by the four beasts, and adored by two apostles and Mary below, who are raising up the sign of the cross, pointing the way to heaven. At times, attempts to portray the supernatural veer towards the comic strip. On the 8th century Worksworth coffin lid, Christ appears to take off in a coffin-shaped spacecraft. While in this 15th century window from Fairford, he seems to be catapulted upward by a rapidly expanding hill. In this heavily repainted boss from Bishop Goldwall's chantry in St Giles Hospital, Norwich, Jesus appears to be breaking through the chapel ceiling. Whatever we may think of the quality of the restoration of the Great West Window at Fairford, it makes a very strong point in its portrayal of the Day of Judgment. The huge contrast between heaven and hell. Hell is shown as dark, formless, and disorganized. By contrast, heaven is light, organized into perfect forms, circles and spheres, and hierarchical. This ordering and perfection is what characterizes the medieval idea of heaven. This page from the Neville of Hornby Hours, dated from the second quarter of the 14th century, shows the fall of Lucifer and his angels. Its importance here is it shows us a map of the heavens and the earth. The earth is at the centre, and it is as though we were looking down at it. Around it are the waters, then the air, then fire, then we reach the 7 spheres of the heavens, and eventually heaven itself. And here we see God and his angels, while Lucifer's angels, transformed into devils, plunge to hell at the bottom. The universe portrayed by Dante is similar to that we've just seen, but it contains one of the most beautiful concepts, as far as I know, not shown in any church art, and that is the celestial rose, where the blessed of the old law and the saints of the new are seated in perfect order in the direct presence of God. Many of the representation of heaven in churches are as part of a doom or last judgment. Incidentally, heaven should not be confused with paradise. The latter is, if you like, the final stage of purgatory, where the soul is restored to its pre-fall purity to await the final doomsday. In Fra Angelico's Last Judgment, painted about 1431, we see the souls of the righteous dancing with angels in paradise and gradually slipping away to enter the glorious light of heaven itself. Here they are dancing in the garden, and then one in pairs, off they go up into heaven itself. While it is a Victorian restoration of the medieval glass, the top portion of the west window at Fairford is still a spectacular evocation of the medieval heaven. Rows of saints and angels surround the victorious Christ with his emblems of justice and mercy. Now, the chancel in St Mary's, Kempley in Worcestershire takes us straight into the heaven of the Book of Revelation with its 12th century paintings. On the arch roof is Christ in glory, surrounded by the four beasts of the Apocalypse, candles and angels. Around the walls are the saints, and yet more angels, while over the window arches is the New Jerusalem. Here is the Christ in glory, with the four beasts around him. And here is one of the windows forming the gateway to the New Jerusalem. It's extraordinary, effective, well, I was going to say mock perspective, but it isn't, because it's going into the window embrasure. So you really have this sense of an entrance. In the Palmieri altarpiece of 1477, Botticini paints the Blessed Virgin arriving in an incredibly ordered and hierarchical heaven, populated by a carefully organized throng of saints and angels. The apostles stand on the mountaintop, contemplating Mary's empty tomb, now miraculously filled with lilies. Only the two kneeling figures, Matteo Palmieri and his wife, the donors of the altarpiece, look up and see heaven opening above them. The mountaintop would have been important to Palmieri. He had written a poem illustrated by Boccaccini, where he describes himself climbing a mountain in order to find and see God in the highest heaven, having first visited the horrors of hell. The mountain that he climbs is called the Mountain of Virtue, and represents our journey back to God, and only those who combine true virtue with real faith made it to the very top, the earthly paradise, where they saw the vision of God in the Empyrean heaven. So, the mountaintop, the top of purgatory, where he can see the world below him and heaven above, was a key to who he personally really was. So, how do we get to heaven? Palmieri's carefully graded hill of accumulating but abstract virtue is great in its way, but ordinary people needed a more down-to-earth set of tasks. Fortunately, there was a biblical blueprint. The Gospel account of Christ's judgment bases salvation on how people treat each other. Christ lists 6 actions which should be done: feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, visiting the sick, and visiting prisoners, saying that whenever they are done for one's fellows, they're done for him. These actions became known as the corporal acts of mercy, and this window showing the 6 corporal acts is in the Freiburg Minster and dates from about 1230. The biblical acts of mercy are shown in this 15th century window in All Saints North Street. The window is a late example of one showing only 6 acts, as the Black Death, coupled with the mystical emphasis on the number 7, led to the introduction of a 7th act of mercy, the burial of the dead, but this window only shows the biblical ones. So here we have our wealthy merchant feeding the hungry. His servant hands out the freshly baked loaves to a group of people, probably pilgrims. In the second scene, he pours drinks for the thirsty, while his servant stands by with cups and flagons, probably small beer rather than water. These people seem to be beggars, to judge by the cripple at the front of the group. He has protective knee pads and small hand crutches. Next, our hero welcomes the stranger, in this case a group of travellers, probably again pilgrims. And then he and his servant hand out truly splendid scarlet clothing to a group of men in their underwear. He visits a sick neighbour, presumably not a pauper, to judge by the handsome bedspread and close stool. He's placing small round items on the bed, but whether these are food or money isn't clear. Finally, the generous merchant puts his hand into his purse, literally, to pay for the release of prisoners in the stocks. He appears also to be bringing them food and drink as well. Though it's possible that that is a bribe to the chap in the background who is in charge. Here we see the 7 works of mercy at Wickhampton in Norfolk. Here, the number 7 has proved a problem for the designer, so the 8th space is filled with Christ blessing the merciful and welcoming them to heaven. The Pickering wall paintings show another treatment of this subject. Sadly, their position high on the walls immediately under the clerestory windows makes them incredibly hard to photograph, so you'll have to forgive the lack of quality in these photos. They show feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, welcoming the stranger, visiting the prisoner, visiting the sick, and finally burying the dead. So here, our fashionably dressed householder hands round loaves to a couple of equally well-dressed pilgrims. These ones we know are pilgrims because if you look very carefully at the right-hand figure, you can see the scallop shell in his hat. He's been to Compostela already. Another householder, or possibly the same one with a change of clothing, holds a large jug with which he refreshes 2 more pilgrims. Next, he welcomes 2 wanderers into his home and gives a cloak to a lame beggar, and then visits a prisoner. These are all so close together that it's really difficult to distinguish the individual pieces. He then visits a sick friend, bringing him a coopered vessel of liquid, maybe a homemade remedy, or just more alcohol, and finally attends a burial of a body. He appears to be holding a sheet of parchment. Perhaps this is an indulgence for the deceased to enable his quick release from purgatory. It looks rather as if there's a picture of a squirrel on it. The nature of heaven was dictated by the idea that there the blessed would be able to see God face to face. This face-to-face encounter was known as the beatific vision. Of course, this is something that's absolutely impossible to portray. However, it hasn't stopped artists trying, some more successfully than others. Here, the 14th century James La Palma has a go. And here is his self-portrait from the same manuscript. Perhaps more successful is a mid-15th century painting of the Trinity and Glory by Jean Fouquet, with again a very, very organised heaven. It's slightly reminiscent of a parliament in its layout. In Barnack Church, we see an Annunciation on the east wall of the Lady Chapel, where the Virgin receives the essence of the Godhead, portrayed as 3 different figures, all coming into her body. This stained glass window shows the Trinity in 3 persons. It's in St. Martin Church in Courgenard in France. Such depictions of the Trinity were mainly made during the 15th and 17th centuries, but they were condemned after the Catholic Council of Trent, and many existing images were destroyed. You can see it here in the church at Sighișoara in Romania, and also on a misericord in Cartmel Priory. A pax is a tablet or board which was used at the end of Mass as part of the Kiss of Peace ritual after the Agnus Dei. First the priest would kiss it, then the members of the congregation. This one was made in France or England at the second half of the 14th century. It shows the Holy Trinity. God the Father, with the cruciform nimbus, is seated on a wide throne. The dove of the Holy Spirit comes from out of his mouth, its beak touching the head of the crucified Christ. The ends of the cross, now broken, are held by God, and you've got sun and moon in the top 2 corners. It's interesting that the head of Christ has been almost completely worn away by people kissing it. Here's the Orthodox view of the Trinity. This is a fresco icon on the ceiling of the entrance of Vatopedian Monastery on Mount Athos. And here, Christ wears the cruciform nimbus, God the Father has a triangular one, and the Spirit is above them both and between them, and they stand with creation between them. The use of symbolic language to portray God has been more successful on the whole. The Immaculate Heart of Mary Catholic Church in Wilmington, Delaware, has a large stained glass window representing the Trinity. You've got the triquetra, a simple symbol where the three equal arcs of the circle express the equality of the three divine persons and their unison, their unity. The hand of God in this is shown at the top, interwoven with a large star, as though acting in the process of creation, symbol of the Father. The Son is symbolized by the cross, which extends through the hole in the framework, and the Holy Spirit by the flames sweeping up through the design. I think this is an absolutely fabulous window, and the more you look at it, the more you see in it. Of all the saints, the highest was believed to be Mary, the Mother of God. Mary is known in the Orthodox Church as Theotokos, the God-bearer, which is rendered by the Catholic Church as Mother of God. One of the great hymns of the Orthodox Church, the Axion Estin, places Mary in the place of honour in heaven. It is truly right to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honourable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. This icon, known as the Axion Estin, is a 10th century icon of the Virgin Hodegetria, the root shower, on Mount Athos. According to legend, as a monk prayed before it, the Archangel Gabriel joined him and taught him the acclamation of the Theotokos. The title Queen of Heaven came into use after the First Council of Ephesus in the 5th century, where Mary was proclaimed Theotokos. In the Hebrew tradition, the Gebira, the Great Lady, usually the mother of the king, held great power as advocate with the king. The position of the Queen Mother, Gebira, was a privilege of the highest honour and was the highest authority for a woman in Israel or Judah. As a result, if Christ was recognized as king, it followed that his mother must also be Gebira, the Queen of Heaven. The stories of Mary's death and her assumption into heaven were various, but the most coherent is that Mary, having spent her life after Pentecost serving the church, was living in the house of the Apostle John in Jerusalem. When the Archangel Gabriel revealed to her that her death would occur 3 days later. The apostles, scattered throughout the world, are said to have been miraculously transported to be at her side when she died. The sole exception was Thomas, who was preaching in India. He is said to have arrived 3 days after her death, and to have seen her body leaving to heaven. When he asked her, "Where are you going?" she took off her girdle and gave it to him, after which she disappeared. Thomas asked his fellow apostles to see her grave, and when they arrived at the grave, her body was gone, leaving a sweet fragrance. This window is in the Church of the Assumption of St Mary the Virgin, Beckley, in Oxfordshire, and dates from the 1330s. And here you see Mary leaning out at heaven to give Thomas her girdle. And in the Cathedral of Prato is the remains of a green and gold silk belt, revered as the belt of the Virgin that she gave him. This is a picture of the Assumption from a 14th century Book of Hours of the Virgin in the British Library. The angels extract Mary from her mountaintop grave and carry her up to heaven. While the previous version seems to show a very physical event, this one from the same volume seems to show the angels raising Mary's soul from the tomb. This alabaster panel depicting the Assumption of the Virgin, with St Thomas receiving the girdle, was made in England during the second half of the 15th century. At some point, probably at the time of the Reformation, it made its way abroad, and is thought to have been acquired for the V&A in Paris under undisclosed circumstances. Teaching of the Assumption of Mary became widespread very quickly across the Christian world, celebrated as early as the 5th century, and established in the East by Emperor Maurice around 600 AD. John Damascene records that in 451, the Bishop of Jerusalem told Emperor Marcion, who wished to possess the body of the Mother of God, that Mary died in the presence of all the apostles, but that her tomb, when opened upon the request of St. Thomas, was found empty, wherefrom the apostles concluded that the body was taken up to heaven. The Assumption of Mary was celebrated in the West by the 8th century, and Pope Leo IV confirmed the feast as official. Theological debate about the Assumption continued following the Reformation, but people celebrated the Assumption as part of the cult of Mary that flourished from the Middle Ages, and in 1950 Pope Pius XII defined it as dogma for the Catholic Church. This 10th century book cover from St. Gall shows her Ascensio, her ascension, surrounded by adoring angels. And for those who remember that, the fall of Lucifer that I showed earlier in the series, this is another Neapolitan ivory group from the 18th century, and this one shows the Assumption. So Mary is welcomed into paradise by Christ, and 6 little wreaths show minute versions of the Nativity of the Virgin, the presentation of the Virgin as a young girl in the temple, her betrothal to Joseph, the Annunciation, the Visitation, and the Immaculate Conception. And the whole thing is no more than about 8 inches high. Extraordinary piece of work. In a cycle of paintings of the death of the Virgin on the south wall of the nave of Brook Church in Kent, we can see the Assumption followed by the coronation of the Virgin as Queen of Heaven. We can also get a glimpse of heaven in the pictures of the Assumption of the Virgin. This 16th century painting in Exeter Cathedral, we see the Holy Trinity leaning down to welcome her as she's carried into heaven by angels through the assembled ranks of the heavenly host. The Assumption of Mary is seen in stained glass, though it is rare for medieval examples to survive in England. This one is in the east window of the Church of the Assumption in Beckley, Oxfordshire, and dates from the 14th century. And I must admit, I think that is quite lovely. Most stained glass versions of the Assumption are in 19th century and 20th century windows in Catholic churches and are mainly pretty dreadful, like this version in St. Leonard's Malton. This one is not improved by having been made for the previous Catholic church and then transferred to the Tower Arch in St. Leonard's, with no real attempt made to fit it or light it properly. But it's an interesting window nonetheless. In the 16th century paintings on the monastic church at Humor in Romania, we see a glimpse of heaven as Mary in her role of Theotokos sits enthroned among the saints. This superb Opus Anglicanum cope, embroidered on deep purple silk velvet, shows the Assumption of Mary surrounded by seraphim to God enthroned above her. There's the detail. That dates from about 1500 and was probably a royal commission. In the Palmieri altarpiece, Botticini shows the Blessed Virgin arriving in this incredibly organized heaven. And another theme that gives us a glimpse of heaven is the coronation of the Virgin, where Mary is crowned by the Trinity as Queen of Heaven. This version is at Pickering, and it shows the Trinity assembled round her, the apostles gathered round, and then a huge crowd of other people looking on over the wall of heaven. This beautiful crozier head was made in Limoges in the mid-13th century, of gilt and enamelled copper. The coronation of the Virgin was one of the commonest designs for croziers at this period, and this may well have belonged to an abbess or abbot rather than a bishop. It's by no means top of the market in Limoges terms, but it is rather lovely. This attractive scene of the coronation of the Virgin is from an ivory diptych made in France during the early 14th century. And this one is a 14th century Florentine painting, probably from a devotional triptych, and again shows Christ himself crowning Mary. I love this one from the 15th century Dunois Ars. Mary kneels formally before God, who blesses her, and an angel flies in the crown for her. A rare survival is this bit of silk brocade orphrey from a 16th century vestment. It's probably Italian, and the entire picture is woven into the fabric. It's not embroidered, but a really lovely bit of weaving. Oops. From Beckley Church again, we see the coronation of the Virgin in the glass. Again, quite a rare survival. This is a Venetian ivory triptych showing the coronation of the Virgin. And here Mary intercedes for the dead on Judgment Day, in a 14th century book of Hours in the British Library. And this leaf, I couldn't resist putting it in. This is from a 13th century Spanish songbook. And it tells how the Blessed Virgin wanted to save a young painter who was trying to paint her as beautifully as he could manage. He always painted the devil uglier than anything. And so the devil asked, "Why do you make me appear so bad to those who see me?" The painter replied, "I do this because you always do evil and don't want to know anything about good." When he said this, the devil became angry and furious with the painter and looked for a way to kill him. One day he followed the young man to where he was painting the image of the Virgin, and it was very beautiful. So the devil raised a strong wind, which knocked down the scaffolding. The painter called on the Virgin, the Mother of God, to come to his aid, and she held onto the brush with which he was painting and prevented the devil from hurting him. The great noise of the falling scaffolding made people rush into the church, and they saw the devil, blacker than fish, rush from the conflict. The people saw how the painter was hanging from the brush and gave praise to the Mother of God. It's a wonderful story and beautifully illustrated. Mary is, of course, joined in heaven by a huge concourse of the saints and the blessed. This page from the Hours of the Virgin, produced in Tournai in the 15th century, illustrates the Feast of All Saints and shows the saints of heaven hierarchically arranged in 6 rows. So at the top, Christ crowns Mary Queen of Heaven, between the Archangel Michael, wearing a helmet and armor, and the Archangel Gabriel. On tier 2, we have the 12 apostles and John the Baptist. Tier 3 shows us St. Christopher carrying the Christ child, St. Nicasius of Rheims, St. Lawrence of Rome, St. Stephen, St. Sebastian, St. George of Cappadocia, Adrian, and on the 4th row we see St. Bryce, St. Remigius, St. Eleutherius, St. Medardus, St. Wenceslas, St. Eustace, St. Anthony, and St. Bonaventure. 5th row gives us St. Apollonia, St. Agatha, St. Barbara, St. Catherine of Alexandria, St. Margaret, an unknown virgin, St. Elizabeth, St. Clare, and St. Scholastica. And right down the bottom we have a similarly unknown virgin, St. Ursula with all her maidens, and St. Verena. I was wondering how to make any selection of saints when I came across the Dunois Hours in the collection of the British Library, and it occurred to me that this would give a good idea of the range of saints to whom one individual might ask to pray for them. So here we have St. Peter, the father of the church, who could also be asked to help with foot problems and fever. St. Paul, the patron saint of writers and scribes, and St. Andrew, the patron saint of fishermen and pregnant women. St. James, patron of pilgrims, St. John Evangelist, patron of charity and friendship, and St. Thomas, the patron saint of builders. And I also think of the people of latecomers. He was late for visiting the resurrected Christ, and he was late for the Assumption of Our Lady. St. Anthony, finder of lost things, St. Christopher, the patron saint of travellers, and St. Leonard, the patron saint of prisoners. St. Martin, the patron saint of soldiers, St. Nicholas, the patron saint of children and sailors, and St. Eustace, the patron saint of huntsmen. St. Lawrence, patron saint of the poor and of cooks. That's a little tasteless. St. George, the patron saint of farmers, as well as of England, and St. Bernard, founder of the Cistercians. St. Julian, the patron of ferrymen and hospitality. St. Mary Magdalene, the patron saint of women. This picture refers to the belief that her corpse was taken by angels directly to paradise. and St. Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. St. Catherine of Alexandria, the patron saint of spinsters and textile workers. St. Genevieve, the patron saint of Paris. This picture shows her going to pray in her chapel by night, and the devil came to blow out her candle, but an angel arrived and relit it for her. And a very graphic St. Apollonia, the patron of sufferers from toothache and of dentists. St. Elizabeth, the patron saint of pregnant women. St. Barbara, the patron saint of armourers and engineers. And St. Mary of Egypt, the patron saint of penitents. Here she is shown with St. Zosimus. As a hermit, she had renounced clothing when Zosimus came upon her in the desert. She asked him for his cloak to cover her nakedness, and then sat him down and told him the rather racy story of her life and conversion, which he wrote down. And last but not least, St. Francis, the patron saint of animals and the poor. Truly, the owner of this book would have had a saint to turn to in any emergency. It just gives us an idea of the number of saints with whom the medieval person felt they had a close relationship and could turn to. Oops. But of course, as well as saints and the blessed, heaven is also inhabited by angels. From the book of Genesis onwards, angels appear throughout the Bible. They appear to Abraham in Genesis 22. This is the angels appearing to him from one of the capitals in Conques in France. And they ascend and descend Jacob's ladder in Genesis 28. This is in the Morgan Bible. I love the angels going down it head first. God sends an angel to stand in the way of Balaam in Numbers 22. This is a Spanish capital, with the angel confronting Balaam's ass. By the time of Isaiah, we meet the seraphim. The word saraph is originally used to mean serpent, and the idea seems to derive from the ancient Egyptian uraeus. Isaiah says, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, and with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. And one cried to another, Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of the hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. A seraph flies down to touch the prophet's lips with a live coal from the altar. This idea of the seraphim shows them as winged celestial beings with a fiery passion for doing God's good work. And the two ideas of God's messenger in the form of a man and these winged creatures gradually coalesce as Christianity develops. The Greek word angelos means messenger, and that's how they appear in the New Testament. They bring news, warnings, and reassurance from God to people. Here, the angel Gabriel announces the birth of Christ to Mary in the 15th century East Window at East Harling in Norfolk. And an angel appears to the 3 kings in a dream to warn them not to go back to Herod from a 12th century window in the north aisle of Canterbury Cathedral. Incidentally, the word angelos seems to derive from angaros, the Persian for courier, and in that form to go back to the Minoan Linear B, akero. So the idea of angels clearly predates Christianity by a very long time. The Lichfield angel at Lichfield Cathedral was probably part of the sarcophagus of St. Chad, who died in 672, and dates from the last years of the 7th century. Originally the background was white, and the angel was painted in red, yellow, white, and ochre, and his halo was probably gilded. You can still see specks of red on his clothes, and black on his wings for shadow effects. It's believed he is Gabriel, and that he stood on the left of the shrine lid, his hand raised in blessing to the Virgin Mary, who would have been on the right in an Annunciation scene. He's carved from Ancaster limestone quarried in Lincolnshire, and was found buried under the floor of the nave of the cathedral in 2003. Of a slightly later date, but equally fine work, is the Bredon Angel at the Hilltop Church of Bredon on the Hill in Leicestershire. The 15th century 9 Orders of Angels window at All Saints North Street shows the individual types of angel, starting at the bottom right. The lowest or 3rd sphere of the heavenly host who are the beings who function as the heavenly guides, protectors, and messengers to human beings, is made up of angels, the lowest order of celestial beings, and the ones most concerned with the affairs of people. Personal guardian angels come from this order. Then we have archangels. They're said to be the guardian angels of nations and countries, and they're concerned with the issues and events surrounding these, and they also protect the church itself. And princedoms, often shown wearing a crown and carrying a scepter. They oversee groups of peoples and are the teachers and guardians of the earth. The angels of the second sphere work as the governors of creation, physically and spiritually. They consist of powers who supervise the movements of the heavenly bodies. They're warrior angels and oppose evil spirits, especially those who make use of the matter of the universe. There are virtues, the angels through which signs and miracles are made in the world, and dominions, who maintain the order of heaven and seldom make themselves physically known to humans. The highest or first sphere of angels are those who serve as the heavenly servants of Christ himself. These are thrones, the living symbols of God's justice and authority. They're often associated with the wheels from the vision of Daniel, appearing as a beryl-coloured wheel within a wheel, their rims covered with hundreds of eyes. Cherubim, who have 4 conjoined wings covered with eyes, and guard the way to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden and to the throne of God. And seraphim, the highest ranking angels and the guardians of God's throne. They continually shout praises. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The 15th century rood screen at Barton Turf in Norfolk is a rare survival, showing powers, virtues, dominations, and seraphim on the left-hand side, and cherubim, principalities, thrones, archangels, and angels on the right. It's extraordinary that this has managed to survive in such good condition. A more modern piece of stained glass is the superb east window at St Etheldreda's Ely Place by Edward Nutkins. Here are some details from Nutkins' window. Here we have the angels, archangels, and principalities, the dominions, virtues, and powers, and the thrones, cherubim, and seraphim. While most of the orders of angels are seen simply as beings, the archangels have a degree of individuality. 2 are named in the New Testament: Gabriel, who visits Mary at the Annunciation in Luke's Gospel, are shown in the east window in Brazier at Harbledon in Kent, and Michael, the leader of the heavenly host in the book of Revelation, shown on the rood screen of Ramworth in Norfolk. Incidentally, the black faces of Gabriel and Mary are because they were painted in the extremely expensive vermilion pigment, which eventually turns black with the air. It's a shame because it must have been an absolutely beautiful bit of painting. And here we have the 4 archangels in the Anglican tradition in an early 20th century stained glass window at Hull Minster. From left to right, Gabriel, Michael, Uriel, and Raphael. Milton, in his poem On the Morning of Christ's Nativity, writes, "Ring out, ye crystal spheres, once bless our human years, if ye have power to touch our senses so. And let your silver chime move in melodious time, and let the bass of heaven's deep organ blow, and with your ninefold harmony make up full consort to the angelic symphony." Pythagoras first noted that the pitch of a musical note is in inverse proportion to the length of the string that produces it, and that intervals between harmonious sound frequencies form simple numerical ratios. In a theory known as the harmony of the spheres, he proposed that the sun, moon, and planets all emit their own unique pitched sound based on their orbital revolution, and that the quality of life on Earth reflects the tenor of celestial sounds that are physically imperceptible to the human ear. Curiously, this does seem to fit remarkably well with findings recently in quantum mechanics. This thinking was largely accepted by medieval thinkers, and may well have been why angels have always been associated with music in the Christian tradition, an idea perhaps linked with the way that medieval thinkers organized the orders of angels into groups called both spheres and choirs. Shakespeare references this idea in The Merchant of Venice. Look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou behold'st, but that his motion like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubins. Such harmony as in immortal souls. But while this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it. This illustration is a 9th century diagram of the positions of the 7 planets on the 18th of March, 816. This is Mary, Queen of Heaven, by the master of the St. Lucy legend, painted about 1490. This painting shows 3 facets of Marian iconography: the Virgin's corporeal assumption, the woman of the Apocalypse, and the coronation of the Virgin. But it is mostly of interest to musicologists, as it shows Renaissance instruments with great accuracy and also reflects contemporary performance practices in the arrangement of the music-making angels. At the top, you have a full orchestra performing to the Trinity. The ensemble round the Virgin is a mixed consort composed of loud instruments, trumpets and shawms, and soft instruments, viol, lute, and harp. 2 of the singing angels hold books bearing legible lyrics and notations identified as the setting of the Marian antiphon Ave Regina Caelorum by Walter Fry, who died in 1474. An English composer whose works were popular on the continent, particularly at the Burgundian court. Norfolk churches are particularly rich in angels, and the Norwich stained glass workshop seem to have specialised in them. Angels can play the harp, assorted stringed instruments, psaltery, sitar, fiddle, and then wind instruments, shawm, bagpipe, portative organ, and organ, church organ. In Exeter Cathedral, the 14th century minstrels gallery is decorated with a stunning selection of angel musicians, playing the cittern, bagpipe, shawm, fiddle, harp, Jew's harp, trumpet, portative organ, psaltery, pipe, tambourine, and cymbals. I've got myself out of kilter. And here's a particularly cheerful angel harpist in Lincoln Cathedral, and rather more unusually, an angel drummer in St. Thomas's, Salisbury. And nearer to home, whoops, gone too far, a selection of more modern angel musicians at St. Michael and All Angels, Thirsk. We have an 18th century gilded wooden one, which was originally on top of the organ, and 3 early 20th century stained glass angels, who I think are delightful. So we come to our final angel musicians, those in the Nativity by Piero della Francesca. For a moment, there we go. It dates to about 1470 and is one of the last surviving paintings made by the artist before his death in 1492.